The Nightmare on Elm Street timeline is a mess. I'm going to level with you. This video has been exhaustively researched and is exhaustively nerdy.
I am the Wizard Master.
Of course, movies are fiction and not beholden to our world of logical temporal continuity. So we could just take each film in the Freddy franchise on its own merit and not worry about how each piece of the puzzle fits into the larger narrative and timeline. We could, but where's the fun in that? If you think you have a firm grasp on this timeline, stay till the end. You'll probably see some details that might surprise you. Wes Craven began writing the screenplay for A Nightmare on Elm Street around 1981, after he had finished production on Swamp Thing in '82. It took a while to get it made. He pitched it to several studios, but each one of them rejected it for different reasons. Finally, the fledgling independent New Line Cinema agreed to produce the film. There's a much longer story there, but we'll cover that in another video. Principal photography began on June 11th, 1984. It was released in the United States on November 9th, 1984, in limited theaters until its nationwide theatrical release on November 16th. The story on screen seemed to be a contemporary one, presumably taking place around the time of release in '84. But are there clues that could lead someone to think it was set in a different time? Forget arguing that the first movie is set anywhere but California. I made a whole video about it. Go check it out after this. Link in the description. In one of the first scenes, we see a California plate on the front of Glenn's 1958 Cadillac Series 62 convertible. It's blue with yellow letters. In 1982, the standard California plate changed to a white background with blue characters, a sun graphic, and California in red block letters. '82 was the last year any blue-yellow plates were issued. So if this story takes place in 1984, either a senior in high school acquired the car and registered it before the changeover in '82, when he would have presumably been 15 or 16, or the car belonged to his parents or someone older. Both are plausible. However, what 16-year-old, or 18-year-old for that matter, is driving around in a pristine vintage Cadillac convertible? California. Some people say that you can see an '84 expiration date on Marge's Volvo when they drive away from Rod's funeral. It's not obvious in the version I'm looking at, but please feel free to go look for yourself. I'll wait. In the next scene at Tina's house, we see Glenn trying to snow his parents by playing a sound effects tape of airport sounds when he calls to let them know that he's staying at his cousin Barry's for the night. But hey, that boombox, it looks to me like a GE Model 3-5259A, dubbed the Blockbuster. That's right, I knew that offhand, no shit. These debuted in 1982, so the '84 setting still works. That is, unless something in the sequels decides to upend the apple cart. Note, Toshiba Blackstripe TV model CE320. Manufacture date is November of 1983. The Evil Dead is playing on the TV in Nancy's room. That movie was released wide in the US on April 15th, 1983. A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, was released on November 1st, 1985, just shy of a year after its predecessor. But in the story, how much time has passed? In Jesse's room, when he's cleaning and doing his little dance routine, he has a poster on his wall featuring 2 albums from the band Simple Minds, Sparkle in the Rain from 1984 and New Gold Dream from '81. The song we hear is Touch Me All Night Long by Fonda Rae and the band Wish, which was released in 1984. A cover version of the song by Kathy Dennis became a big hit 7 years later in '91. Stay with me. When Lisa reads from Nancy's diary, she says, "You know this thing is 5 years old?" Presumably, the time duration was written into the script to distance the high school-age characters of this story from the kids in the first film.
You know her?
No, before my time.
Otherwise, it's quite unbelievable that the events of Nightmare 1 wouldn't have been well known by the teenagers in this story. There's an entry from March 15th where Nancy writes about the scary dream man. His name is Fred. If we jump back to the previous film, the events proceed as follows. After Rod's funeral, Marge takes Nancy to the dream clinic. It's there that she realizes that she can bring things out of her dreams when she wakes up from a nightmare, holding Freddy's old fedora. The next scene is the one where she confronts her mom about who Fred Krueger is, because she read his name written in the hat.
Fred Krueger, Mom.
Before this, she didn't know him by name.
I don't know who he is, but he's burned.
In the scene, it's implied that it's the day after the occurrence at the sleep clinic and that Nancy hadn't slept at all the night before. Since she mentions his name specifically as Fred in the diary entry, logic dictates that this entry was written the night she and her mom came home from the clinic. So this must be March 15th. The next day when she gets home in the evening, Marge has had the bars installed on the windows. I guess contractors were a lot more efficient in the mid-'80s. I doubt Marge did it herself because she would have either been drunk or had the shakes, and those things look way too level for that. She takes her down to the basement to tell her the whole story about Freddy Krueger. The same night Glenn is killed and Nancy has her fateful encounter with Freddy and supposedly vanquishes him. March 16th. If we assume the events of numero uno happened in 1984, then we can assume the events of numero tuo take place in the spring of 1989. Awfully cold time of year for a pool party in Ohio. But I digress. Or conversely, if this is 85, like its release year, then the first film must be set in 1980 or 81. Of course, if you look at which day of the week March 16th fell in 1984, it was Friday. But in this close-up of Nancy's vintage Loris digital watch, it says it's Tuesday. Teenagers, so disorganized. Of course, try it the other way and it's still inaccurate. If A Nightmare on Elm Street was meant to take place in 80 or 81, March 15th would have been on Sunday or Monday, respectively. Now we know that technically this is impossible because anachronisms concerning the electronics featured on screen, and more obviously the fact that we see The Evil Dead playing on the TV, which wasn't even released in theaters nationwide until '83. So we'll stick with the Nightmare 2 taking place in 1989 theory. A little weird that Jesse would have a poster in his room that featured an album from 8 years prior, but maybe he was rocking out to Simple Minds in 5th grade. In the pool party scene, you can see Ava Cherry's album Streetcar Named Desire, which came out in '82. Let's cover some additional inconsistencies between the two films. In the locker room, Grady says to Jesse about the house he just moved into. Some chick was locked in there by her mother, and she went crazy. She watched her boyfriend get butchered across the street by some maniac. And later, when they're reading the diary, Jesse says this. The girl who used to live here, how she went crazy when she saw her boyfriend get murdered across the street. And then there's this scene.
Dad, how come it took him 5 years to sell this house?
Oh, I don't know. I just couldn't get the right price, I suppose.
You didn't know anything about the murder across the street? And the crazy girl that lived here that saw the whole thing?
They told me something about it, yeah, but
You mean you knew something about this and
Oh,
you...
come on, Cheryl. How do you think we got such a good deal here, huh?
Did they tell you that girl lost her mind and her mother killed herself in our living room?
What?
Did they tell you that?
It's unclear where Jesse learned this information, but it's inconsistent with the events as they unfold in the first film. It's mentioned multiple times that Nancy saw Glenn get killed, but that never happens. She's locked in her own house at the time. I always thought it was a little odd how this scene was cut. It seems to suggest that Nancy just knows that Glenn is being murdered, even though she's in her living room and awake. She wouldn't even have had a vantage point to see something happening through her window, but I guess we could just chalk that up to historical distortions. I mean, that's sort of realistic. And the claim that Marge self-deleted, well, it's possible that she did. The end of part 1 is a bit hazy on what is dream and what is real. Maybe the stress of everything and her alcoholism caused her to take that way out. Or maybe Freddy got her and it just looked that way. Either way, it's still unclear how Jesse knows this. In Nightmare 3, Nancy says that her mother died in her sleep.
She died in her sleep.
This could be another inconsistency, but it's reasonable that Nancy would say that to avoid the unpleasantness of the truth. Dream Warriors was released at the end of February of 1987, about 16 months after Freddy's Revenge. Let's figure out where it fits into the timeline. In the beginning of the film, we learn of a rash of teen self-deletions happening in the town of Springwood. It's unclear how many, but on the radio, a newsreader mentions 2 more and an alarming trend. Later, when Dr. Gordon sits down to talk with Nancy for the first time, he says that they lost a kid about a month ago.
We lost a kid about a month ago to Fairview. I don't know where he got the razors, but he cut off his own eyelids to stay awake.
When they discuss Nancy joining the staff, Dr. Gordon calls her a grad school superstar. This implies that she's enrolled in a postgraduate educational institution. That means that she most likely has spent at least 4 years in college getting her bachelor's degree. Assuming that she was in her senior year of high school in Nightmare 1, and as we've covered, the events of that film would have happened about 3 months before the end of the school year. Based on the diary entry in part 2, it would have to be at least 5 years after the first Freddy flick took place. In a scene that happens about halfway through the film, Nancy says this.
6 years ago, he killed my friends. He almost killed me.
So we now know that this is supposed to take place 6 years after part 1, and we got to assume 1 year after part 2. But what year is this? We need more clues. Oh. Nancy's Hypnosil was prescribed in May of 1989, so this must be a little after that. Let's assume June. If we rewind 6 years, that puts us at the summer of 1983, a bit earlier than March of '84, but it's reasonable to think that Nancy is just rounding up to keep things pithy while she's revealing this information to the kids. So that supports the part 1 occurring in the spring of '84 theory and pretty much discredits the '80-'81 possibility. But how does that line up with part 2? If part 2 happened around March of '89, then this story is happening just a few months later. It's very odd that the kids of Springwood wouldn't have heard anything about what happened in 2, especially the stuff about Freddy running around and attacking teenagers at a pool party. But that brings me to another one of my convoluted theories. Perhaps more of part 2 is a dream than we're led to believe. If you factor in the ending, which negates much of the previous 20 minutes of runtime in that film, perhaps it's all a dream. Maybe Jesse's family moved into that house and Freddy got to him in his nightmares. Maybe he was just one of the teen casualties we heard about in the beginning of part 3. Could even be that he was committed and he's the patient that cut his own eyelids off. It's a stretch, but so is pretty much everything that happens in part 2. So let's move on. It's in Dream Warriors that more of Freddy's backstory is revealed. Dr. Gordon encounters Sister Mary Helena, Amanda Kruger, and he mentions that the hospital had been closed in the 40s after an incident. She tells him the story of how Freddy was conceived. He also says this wing's been closed for years when discussing the past tragedy with Sister Helena. Amanda's story clearly occurred in a wing of Weston Hills. When her gravestone is revealed at the end, we see that she was born in 1907 and died in 1968. Not to jump ahead, but this means that she was still alive after Freddy's kid was taken away by the state in '66, if you believe the crazy guy from Freddy's Dead. We'll get there in a minute. Lots of threads online claim that Dream Master takes place in 1988, the year it was released. This seems to be entirely based on the fact that in the beginning of Nightmare 5, we see that the kids are graduating and it's '89. one of the few times we see a specific year shown. For that to be true, we would have to go back and negate several pieces of evidence from the previous films. But let's run with it for a minute. If this isn't in fact 1988, then in theory, the events of Part 2 occurred just about 2 years ago, assuming Nancy's story actually did begin in 1981. And the house looks like this now. It's been a rough couple of years. Maybe Freddy remodeled to fit his aesthetic. If Nightmare 1 did take place in 1984, then the events of Part 2 haven't even happened yet, let alone Part 3. But of course that's not possible because here's several characters popping up from that film, and time has clearly passed. Kincaid has a dog now, Joey won't shut the hell up and has at least 12 months of hair growth, and Kristen, well, she pretty much looks the same. I told you this timeline was a mess. Let's move on. In the scene where Alice goes to the theater, we see several inside jokes. The movie Prison is playing, which is director Rennie Harlin's previous film. John Waters' Hairspray also has a poster, which was a film produced by Bob Shaye and New Line, which came out around the same time. And Reefer Madness, which was one of the first movies New Line distributed in its infancy. Because of the connections to the filmmakers, I'll disregard. It's not there to give us time frame, it's just a wink at the audience. At this point, it seems clear that the people behind these movies have pretty much given up on a coherent timeline and are just setting the films in the years that they were set to be released. With Nancy's house shown to be dilapidated and boarded up, and the new characters being seemingly oblivious to the events that occurred in their town.
And if he kills you in your dream, you're dead for real.
It really doesn't add up, so maybe they thought, let's just simplify and keep these movies contemporary. That'll make things much, much easier. Ah, shit. So Freddy's Dead is set 10 years from now. It was released in 91, so do they mean 2001? If they did, just say that. Not this franchise. Or do they mean 10 years from the previous movie, which I suppose would make this 1999 since we see the Class of '89 banner? I think they just mean that it's set in an indiscernible future. Of course, you also have to ignore the marketing of the film where the teaser poster implies that Freddy dies on the release date of the movie, September 13th, 1991. But that poster isn't the boss of us, so ignore it we will. Again, they've written themselves into a corner because the story demands that a decent amount of time has passed since the events of the previous films. Let's try to make sense out of this. The main concept of this film is stated in that clunky opening prologue. The town of Springwood, Ohio, has devolved into a desolate hellscape of dead children and psychotic adults. This film is pretty broad and they're clearly going for a wackier tone, except for all the horrific child abuse flashbacks. So when they show up there, you get a surreal, dime store version of a David Lynch movie that looks and feels nothing like the all-American suburb presented in the previous films. The amount of time that would have to pass to get from the Springwood of the last film and this seems a lot longer than 10 years. But we can try to fit this one in the timeline with the others if we look back at Freddy's past. One of the high points of this film is the sequence, originally in 3D, that shows Freddy's backstory, along with the rundown of Freddy's timeline from this under-celebrated performance from character actor Matthew Faison, who a lot of people don't realize also played this guy. Now we got to ignore the body text from these news stories in the scrapbook because it's all nonsense, unless you want up-to-the-date sports reporting. We know from the dialogue that in 1493, Freddy sailed across the sea. I think this guy is just nuts. Wait, what am I doing? Does any of this shit make sense? God.
We covered this. This is where they took away its child.
child.
Oh, okay, we're back on track. Whew. I thought I was wasting my life for a moment. We see a wall in the school that memorializes all of the dead kids of Springwood. We get names and the class year. Side note, what production designer came up with these names? The waspiest sounding. Never mind. According to this, kids started dying in the mid to late 70s. Assuming Freddy was to blame, it goes well into the mid 80s. And they talk about his child being taken away in 1966. Most of what this guy says is bonkers, but let's assume this is meant to be factual. Freddy's child was taken away in 1966. It is now in the story either 1999 or 2001. Freddy's daughter in the flashbacks is at least 6 or 7. In the adoption papers that they find list her as 8 at the time of adoption, so now we're talking about someone who is probably around 40. Lisa Zane was 30 when the movie was shot. And Sean Greenblatt, who played John Doe and thought he was Freddy's kid, was 24. When we jump into Freddy's memories, we first land on him in grade school having some free time with the class pet gerbil. Should have been around 1950 based on Amanda's tombstone and other clues. Costuming and decor seem to work with that assumption. Then we see teenage Freddy with his adopted father, played by pop sensation Vincent Furnier. I guess this would be in the late 50s, still a few years away from marriage, fatherhood, and, all the serial killing. In part 5, we learn that Freddy's mother, Amanda, supposedly topped herself after his trial, but they couldn't find the body. The gravestone was just a memorial. If this happened in 1968, then it makes sense that Maggie was taken away at the time of his arrest in '66. What's not entirely clear is how much time passed between his trial/release and his demise at the hands of the parents of Springwood. Did Amanda die before Freddy or after? Alice implies that Freddy was actually the one who killed Amanda.
He must have done it.
Was that before or after he was dead himself? Did he get into her dreams? Another inconsistency concerning Weston Hills. We first see that facility in part 3. Doc Gordon talks about how the place was closed down in the 40s after an incident.
This whole facility was shut down in the 40s, wasn't it? Some sort of scandal?
We assume that he's probably referring to the accidental locking in and assault of Amanda at the hands of the prisoners. But by the time the events of Dream Warriors, the facility is back up and running. This is supposed to be just a few years before when part 5 takes place. So what the hell asylum is depicted in that film? It's clearly not Weston Hills because it looks completely different and has obviously been abandoned for years. If you look online, you might see references to the Hathaway house being a part of Amanda Kruger's story. This is never mentioned in the films. It seems to derive from the novel The Nightmares on Elm Street Parts 1, 2, 3, the continuing story, published February 15, 1987, and written by Jeffrey Cooper. In it, it's implied that Nancy's house was used as a sanitarium in the 30s. The origin story, taken from the original Nightmare 3 script, involved the house at 1428 Elm Street being an old insane asylum, years before Freddy's birth. Amanda Kruger was a patient and pregnant, and she died delivering Freddy. The asylum was moved sometime later to Weston Hills, and the old Hathaway house became the Thompson home. But forget all that, because this part of Freddy's backstory gets completely ignored in Freddy's Dead, and instead they focus on his childhood and young adulthood, which we really haven't explored up to this point. I see the thought behind this. The overriding theme in part 6 is trauma stemming from abuse or neglect at a young age, and in a lazy way tries to draw comparisons between Freddy and his victims. So, ignoring that pesky poster, Dream World Freddy's quote-unquote death occurred around 2000, give or take. The next film in the franchise was Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which came out in '94. The story takes place in the supposed real world, outside of the timeline of the other movies, so we'll skip over it to the last film in this timeline, 2003's Freddy vs. Jason. The road to a film being made about these two horror icons going toe-to-toe took over a decade and almost manifested in several different forms. But that's a story for another time. This film arrived 12 years after Freddy's dead. How much time has passed in the story? If we take the prologue of Freddy's Dead literally, then this film occurs about 2 years after the events of that film, assuming that it's set in 2003, the year of release. Does that make any sense? No, of course not. The town of Springwood looks and feels like a normal town again. We have high school-aged kids doing normal teenager stuff with no recollection of Freddy or the events of the other movies. They certainly don't seem to be aware of the town being full of psychotic adults who have been driven insane by Kruger's endless massacre of their kids, and the town being devoid of anyone under 35. So what's the deal here? The backstory is presented in small bites. In Freddy's history, it's been shown that his power is tied to the fear he inspires in his victims, kind of like Candyman or that girl from this meme. Somehow, the powers that be in town figured this out and started quarantining any kid who has had contact with Freddy in their dreams, shuffling them off to Weston Hills, which I guess looks like this now, and pumping them full of the anti-dream medication Hypnosil, the same drug Nancy was on in Part 3. Fun concept, but how is this possible from a timeline perspective? We hear the sheriff say, this has given us 4 years of peace. What? How does that add up? We're first introduced to our lead character, Lori, played by Monica Keena. In this scene, we learn that she still has the hots for her ex-boyfriend, Will, through expertly crafted lines like this.
You were fucking 14, so get over it.
Yeah, I know we were young, but what Will and I had was real.
And that they were together when she was 14, and hopefully so was he. He apparently moved away with no goodbye or contact of any kind, which we later find out isn't the whole story. We also find out that her mom died not too long ago.
Barely gone out since what? Since my mom died? Yeah, well, you know what? My dad needs me.
I'm getting major Sidney Prescott vibes. Through some more stellar expository dialogue, we get a hint from the cops that this is supposed to be Nancy's house from the first film.
It's even the same damn house. 1428 Elm. It's gotta be him, right? It's gotta be Freddy Krueger.
And that a murder was carried out there by Freddy Krueger a few years ago. But that info has been kept under wraps. Lori kind of overhears this exchange, and Krueger's name embeds itself in her subconscious or something, I guess. I'm not sure that this sheriff is the sharpest point on the star. The town's whole strategy for keeping Freddy at bay is to make sure no one finds out about him. But then in 2 successive scenes, he carelessly mentions it with people nearby and well within earshot.
You better make damn sure none of those kids knows anything, or I'll send your ass up to Weston Hills with them.
Knows what? What do you mean?
Oh well. That was a real nice batch of non-dead teenagers we had once.
Nah, man, it's bullshit. I heard some guy Krueger killed him.
It's implied that Lori's boyfriend and his friend Mark have been locked up in Weston Hills for 4 years, and that Will believes he saw Lori's dad murder Lori's mom. We see in a flashback that Will, the 14-year-old, looks a hell of a lot like Will, the 18-year-old. Also, if this backstory happened 4 years ago, and this is 2003, then what we see in the flashback at Lori's house happened previous to Freddy's Dead, or I guess concurrently, presuming that the story of Freddy's Dead occurred in 1999, based on the 10 years later prologue, and Dream Child taking place in 1989, instead of 10 years after the release year of 1991. I have a headache. So for the timeline to match up, this cannot be set in 2003. Does the movie give any clues to when? Maybe Lori has some pertinent insight.
Wait a minute. Freddy died by fire, Jason by water. How can we use that?
Have you ever noticed that the word script sounds a lot like shit if you say it fast? Script, shit, shit, script, shit, script, script, shit. Anyway, maybe this web search will illuminate things. Nonsense. All nonsense. Why would a psychiatric hospital have a room like this? Why? No clues about the timeline, but this scene with Linderman stabbing Jason with the U.S. flag kind of reminds me of something.
Yield this, Senator Payne.
I'm getting off track here. But what about timeline clues? Here we go. This sign at the construction site says occupancy spring 2004. So this has to be 2003 or sooner, which means that 4 years previous would be 1999, the earliest that Freddy's dead could be said. So then the flashbacks in this movie make no sense, let alone the current state of Springwood as we see it here. Okay, got it. This timeline is a mess. Confirmed. There you go. Now, I didn't include the TV show Freddy's Nightmares because it would have truly been a nightmare to figure out where that intersected with the timeline. And I didn't include the comic books because that's a whole other can of worms. Also, the remake was excluded because it's not supposed to fit within the timeline of these films and because it sucks. What did I miss? Please tell me in the comments. I love this series. It's not without its flaws. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Tell me where I'm wrong. Dread Diver out.